Welcome. My name is Sacajawea. Some of you may have heard of me before, right? Well, anyway, most people know me as the Native American guide who helped Lewis and Clark on their expedition. That's what I'm here to tell you about today. It all started on a fall day when men in boats came to our Mandan and Hidatsa villages. They were traveling up the Missouri, talking about reaching a great water source where the land ends. These men needed a place to stay for the winter before they continued on their journey. The chiefs decided to let them live with us for the winter. The men quickly started building a large lodge out of trees. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were the men in charge of the others. One day they started talking to my husband about his help for the rest of the journey west. My husband is named Toussaint Charbonneau. He is a French-Canadian trader. These men had wanted him to join their expedition as an interpreter. You see, Toussaint spoke Hidatsa and French, and one of the men, Francois Labiche, spoke French and English. Lewis and Clark spoke English. This way the men could communicate with other tribes of Native Americans along their trip. I think part of the reason Lewis and Clark wanted Toussaint to come on their expedition was due to me. I spoke Hidatsa as well as Shoshone, the language of my people. About 3 years before Lewis and Clark arrived in our village, I was taken from my Shoshone people and brought to live here with a Hidatsa. It happened during a buffalo hunt when our enemy tribe, the Hidatsa, took me. Lewis and Clark knew my people would be valuable to them later on in their journey and hoped that I could help them get horses to cross the mountains. I do miss the mountains and my homeland. I was born in land surrounded by the Rocky Mountains near the Salmon River. I was the daughter of the chief. I had a great 12 years of life here before the Hidatsa took me back to their village. I had been here with the Hidatsa in Mandan for 3 years when Lewis and Clark arrived, and I hadn't seen my homeland since I was taken. But things weren't all so bad. Toussaint and I were expecting our first child when these men arrived. In February of that winter, I gave birth to a son. We named him Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Clark, who is there for his birth, nicknamed him Pomp, or sometimes Pompey. We left the Hidatsa villages. With the expedition in April, when my baby was 2 months old, I carried him on my back on a cradle board to keep him safe and warm as we traveled through rivers and over mountains. This also allowed my hands to be free so I could help the expedition. After we left the villages, I helped the men search for food. They hunted big game such as buffalo when they were near. Otherwise, I helped them find edible plants and roots. I knew which plants could be eaten and which could be used for medicine. I dug for roots we could eat and picked berries. I showed the men which plants we could eat. It always amazed me how little these men knew about the land we lived on. About a month after we left the villages, the boat I was traveling in flipped over. I managed to gather up the supplies that fell out of the boat. The men were frantic and wailing around the boat, but they were only pushing the objects further away as they splashed through the water. I knew if I could just stay calm and move swiftly through the water, I had a better chance of getting everything that fell out. The men were very thankful for my help, especially Clark, because I had saved the journals he was always writing in. A couple of days later, Lewis and Clark named a river after me for all the help I had provided them. About a week later, we came to the Great Falls of the Missouri. They were beautiful, but I knew they were very dangerous. It took us 53 days to travel around them. I helped the men carry the canoes and supplies over the bluffs as we went around the falls. It was one of the hardest times of the whole trip, but we made it around and continued on. As we continued on our journey, I began recognizing parts of the land from my childhood. I knew we were getting close to the Shoshone and the mountains. We finally reached the Shoshone village in August. I was there to help negotiate a trade for horses so the expedition could cross the Bitterroot Mountains. When I went to meet the chief, I was given a fantastic surprise that still warms my heart. The chief was my brother Camelot. I felt such joy as we were reunited again. It had been many years since I had seen him, and I had missed him tremendously. He generously gave us the horses we needed, and we continued on our journey. We prepared to cross the mountains. The mountains were tough to cross, and the men nearly starved on the journey across. I did my best to find things we could eat, but there wasn't as much in the mountains. We came out of the mountains 11 days later into the land of the Nez Perce. Many tribes helped us along the way. The Nez Perce were just one. I think I helped keep things peaceful between the expedition and the tribes. Most tribes were less suspicious of the men since they were traveling with me and Jean-Baptiste. If the men were going to attack the tribes, they wouldn't travel with a woman and child, so tribes became curious of us and came to help. The Nez Perce helped by generously providing us with food and showed the men how to make new canoes. We left them in October down the Clearwater River, which fed into the Columbia River. This would take us to the end of the land. About 1.5 months we traveled those rivers. Then we finally reached the great water source the men were trying to find, the Pacific Ocean. Winter was coming soon, so the expedition decided to stay near the ocean. I was given a vote on where we should build our shelter for the winter. We stayed in the land of the Clatsop tribe, which is who Lewis and Clark named the shelter after. The winter was pretty hard on the men. It rained every day but 6 while we were in the shelter. The men felt very homesick, a feeling I was used to. In March it was warm enough to leave and head back to our homelands. It took us 2 months to get back to the Nez Perce tribe, who took care of our horses over the winter. We had to wait another month until June to travel back across the Bitterroot Mountains. When we crossed back over the mountains, the group stopped at a spot they called Traveler's Rest. Lewis and Clark wanted to split the group so each could explore a different river. I went with Clark. As we traveled, I started remembering more and more Shoshone trails from my childhood. I was able to lead the men across the Bozeman Pass to the Yellowstone River, which is where the men were trying to go. I was able to help the men successfully cross over some dangerous land. At one point, Clark named a large rock Pompey's Tower. He put his name and the date into the rock. This was the only mark on the land the men left on their trip. About a month after the group split, they joined back together. 2 days later, we had returned to the Hidatsa and Mandan villages. Toussaint, Jean-Baptiste, and I said goodbye to the expedition and returned to our home. We had been gone for 1 year, 4 months, and 7 days. The villagers were curious of what we saw in the far west land. We told them stories of our trip. Lewis and Clark made it back to their homeland, and all of their men in the east knew about them. Clark remained close to Pomp, who he had grown fond of during our trip. Not very much is known about my life after I left the expedition. Some people say I died at a young age from being sick, but others say I went back home to my Shoshone people and lived to be over 100 years old. But no matter what people say, they always have remembered me and all I did to help Lewis and Clark on their expedition.